Ohio State has its quarterback for the 2026 recruiting class. Luke Fahey, four-star quarterback from Mission Viejo, California, announced his commitment to Ohio State on Thursday, bringing kind of a quick end to his recruitment from the time he was offered by Ohio State, but a longer journey for Ohio State to find its quarterback in the 2026 class. As you know, Ohio State pursued some of the bigger names in the class, guys like Jared Curtis, Diabell, Faison Brandon, Ryder Lyons. Ultimately, all of those guys going elsewhere. Ohio State deciding just a couple weekends ago to offer Luke Fahey on his official visit. He was the only quarterback to make an official visit during the month of June, so it was clear at that point he was their guy, their target for the 2026 class. And now, less than 2 weeks later, Ohio State has its quarterback for the 2026 recruiting class, Luke Fahey, continuing a trend for Ohio State of going into Southern California and getting quarterbacks. It's been a successful strategy for Ohio State before. Obviously, CJ Stroud, a guy who was not a super highly touted guy at this time going into his senior year, ends up soaring up the rankings in his senior year, becomes a Buckeye, becomes one of Ohio State's greatest quarterbacks ever. Now he's one of the top quarterbacks in the NFL. You've got Julian Sayin, the guy who we think is probably going to be Ohio State's starting quarterback in 2025. Some similarities there as well. You're talking about a guy maybe a little bit undersized. Now, Luke Fahey's not being touted the same way Julian Sayin was. Julian Sayin was a guy who was the number one quarterback in his recruiting class. Luke Fahey, a guy who comes in, four-star recruit, I believe ranked as the number 24 quarterback in his class. So not as highly touted maybe as some of the quarterbacks we've seen Ohio State get in recent years, whether that be Tavien St. Clair or Julian Sayin. You know, you go back to guys like CJ Stroud, even guys like Kyle McCord, Devin Brown, they had higher ratings than Luke Fahey. But watching Luke Fahey's film, reading more about him, you're talking about a guy who completed 76% of his passes last year, hasn't even been a full-time starter in high school yet, and has still put up some really good numbers. And so watching the film, seeing the kind of quarterback that Luke Fahey is, he seems like a guy who can be a good fit for Ohio State.
Yeah, 76% completions, but also 0 interceptions stands out in his stat line from last season. And, you know, I don't think there's a good one-to-one comparison to make here to CJ Stroud. There's clear differences, and I think the types of quarterbacks they are, and also Luke being a little more undersized than CJ was, perhaps they're at 6 feet even. But that's where I see kind of a parallel between them as two Southern California guys who were maybe underrated coming out of high school. Luke Fahey still has to prove he's underrated, of course, but for CJ Stroud, it was never CJ wowing you with his pure arm strength, his pure athletic gifts, his pure just like those inherent things that it's really easy to spot as a quarterback and as an elite quarterback prospect. It was the accuracy. At Ohio State, CJ Stroud had this unique ability to he sort of drop his throws into a bucket where a lot of quarterbacks you would expect them to just like zip it in there as hard as they can. CJ knew how to place the ball so perfectly. His accuracy was so deadly that it made up for maybe him not being the strongest natural thrower. And I think that's where Luke Fahey excels on film, as you mentioned, Dan, is that maybe it's not the biggest cannon attached to his shoulder, but he's got, again, 76% completions for a high school player is pretty outstanding. And on the tape, there's some downfield shots in there too. It's not just all the little dump off on a bubble screen to a receiver or an easy like slant pattern or something of that nature. He was able to show accuracy on downfield shots on some of the tape. I think there will be areas to work on when it comes to his mechanics, when it comes to taking that next step. Obviously, learning the Ohio State offense and diagnosing collegiate defenses is completely different than what he's seeing in high school. But I think his accuracy and his decision-making and poise and ability to maneuver in the pocket are pretty ahead of where a lot of other high school quarterbacks are, certainly as coming off of their junior year.
Yeah, you mentioned 0 interceptions compared to 17 touchdowns. I mean, that's always going to be a good touchdown interception ratio. And granted, he has had a lot of receiving talent to work with at Mission Viejo. He had Philip Bell, a guy who's now a freshman at Ohio State. That's one reason why Luke Fahey is now coming to Ohio State, is that connection he had with his former receiver, Philip Bell at Mission Viejo. Now they'll be reunited a year from now at Ohio State. Also, Vance Spafford, a Miami wide receiver commit. So, he's throwing to 2 receivers there who are, elite talents. That's always going to help. But nevertheless, you look at those stats, 76.6 completion percentage, 15.6 yards per attempt. That's always going to be good numbers to see for a quarterback. And so I think, you see the traits there. You see why Ohio State ultimately identified Luke Fahey as its quarterback for the 2026 class. Because, again, you're talking about a guy who's shown a lot of accuracy. You're talking about a guy who makes good decisions with the ball, is a smart processor. Those are all things that Ryan Day really values in a quarterback. And he's got that athleticism, too. Again, it could be a question, kind of like we've talked about with Julian Sayin for the year ahead, of, okay, being a smaller guy, not a big guy like a Will Howard, okay, do you have a little bit more concern about using a guy like that in the running game? But he has shown he at least has that athleticism to extend plays, to take off when needed. And so I think, the biggest question is probably going to be that size, just the fact that, he lists himself on his social media as 6'1", 185. So we'll give him that 1 inch there. But, a little bit smaller than the typical Big Ten quarterback, but then again, so is Julian Sayin. So you don't want to. It's not all about size. It's about skill. It's about passing ability. It's about decision making. All those things. And I think Luke Fahey has shown that he has a lot of that. And I kind of, like we talked about with C.J. Stroud, I wouldn't be surprised if Luke Fahey is a guy who moves up the rankings here in his senior year, because of the fact that he hasn't been a full-time starter at the high school level yet. They had another quarterback there the last couple of years, Dre Trudreau. He was a three-star quarterback. So they basically split snaps the last couple of years there at Mission Viejo. So now that he'll have the opportunity to really be the guy, take all the snaps, put up bigger numbers in his senior year, I wouldn't be surprised if he moves up the rankings. And there's also the fact that Ohio State, in terms of his 2026 class, they didn't necessarily need a 5-star QB in this class. They just needed somebody who could come in and be a guy who can compete in the future. Because you look at kind of a likely forecast for the future of that quarterback room. We think Julian Sayin's probably going to be the starting quarterback this year. If that's the case, we think he'll probably be the starting quarterback for the next 2 years at Ohio State. And so you're looking at Luke Fahey now coming in next year. He can come in, depending on what Lincoln Keenholz decides, or you're talking about guys probably 3rd, 4th string quarterback next year. Tavien St. Clair probably going to be ahead of him on the depth chart. And then you think ahead to 2027, that's most likely when Luke Fahey, as a second-year quarterback at Ohio State, is going to be competing with Tavien St. Clair, is going to be competing with another quarterback from Southern California, Brady Edmunds, who's been committed already to Ohio State for quite some time and seems to be about as all in on Ohio State as anybody can be. I mean, Brady Edmunds, the guy is constantly posting on social media about how much he loves Ohio State. He was there for like a whole week this summer. Brady Edmunds, I think that commitment is, in today's modern recruiting world, I think that commitment is about as solid as it gets. With just the way Brady Edmunds just clearly loves Ohio State and is already ingraining himself in that culture. And then there's also the possibility they bring in somebody else there along that line too, because we have seen Ohio State this summer take a look at some of our 2027 quarterbacks. They had quite a few of the top quarterbacks in that class on campus this summer, including Elijah Haven, the number 1 quarterback in that class. And so it does seem like, even with Luke Fahey coming in, Ohio State would like to get a second quarterback for the 2027 class. Not necessarily because of anything they don't like with Brady Edmunds, more just a fact of we've heard Ryan Day talk about before, you wanted to have 4 quarterbacks in that room. We saw this year they had to go out and get Eli Brickhandler, a guy who, had completed less than 50% of his passes at an FCS school to fill out that quarterback room. And so I think there is that desire, to bring in 2 quarterbacks in that 2027 class just to kind of get the numbers back up in that room. But that's what made it really important, with Ohio State being a little bit behind in the 2026 class to come out of this summer with somebody committed in the class. And they ultimately were able to find that in Luke Fahey.
Right. And we've heard Ryan Day say multiple times throughout his tenure, he wants 4 quarterbacks in that room, 4 scholarship quarterbacks in that room for depth purposes to have at the ready. And that's another reason, like you said, why you might see 2 quarterbacks taken in 2027. And, I think Garrick has also expressed that behind the scenes to us on a couple occasions, that it seems like the idea is going to be to take 2 quarterbacks in 2027. It's probably written about that in several stories too. He's enjoying a well-earned vacation right now after a very busy June. But yeah, as you look forward to the shape of this quarterback room, and it's clear, I think with the modern state of quarterback recruiting, it's hard to get that 5-star every single cycle. Ohio State had 2 fantastic quarterback cycles back to back in getting Julian Sayin with Air Noland, who has since transferred, of course, but and Julian wasn't a commit, he was a transfer from Alabama. We don't need to rehash the whole process there, but getting Tavien right after, I think there was always a sense maybe that 2026 could be a year where you're not going to get that 5-star guy. But I think even in these years, and they did the same with Lincoln Keenholz, who is now well entrenched in that quarterback competition heading into preseason camp for Ohio State, I think, that you can get a really good quality 4-star guy who's got some really good malleable traits, and coach them up, and maybe they become that Ohio State caliber starter one day and pop toward the end of their career, or even if they get that development at Ohio State, then ultimately transfer elsewhere to start. There's a lot. You need that for the depth that Ryan Day wants in that quarterback room, and so for that need, for that thing, I think it's important to have gotten Luke Fahey now in this class. You have that depth going forward. You have Brady Edmunds locked in, and to your point, Dan, just yesterday, we've seen Brady Edmunds publicly tweeting, "Hey, commit to Ohio State. It's the place to be," etc. A guy who is so active peer recruiting. When you talk to him, we talked to him at Ohio State's recruiting camps this summer, so all in on Ohio State, as you mentioned. And that's even with the consideration, because he was asked about it at those camps, of maybe bringing on a second quarterback in the class. I think it's something that he has expressed he's open to, and he's willing to compete down the road for that. And I think having Brady Edmunds already in the fold also allows Ohio State to be pretty picky about who that second quarterback is. Maybe you go get that sort of 5-star caliber talent going forward and have that juice into the room that, it injects when you get that sort of 5-star guy. So I think that is where there's a pretty clear plan of attack for the next 2 years now in the recruiting cycles for Ohio State at quarterback. They've got their guy in 2026. They've got a guy in 2027, and you can be picky about who that second guy is to join him.
It doesn't hurt that in that 2027 class, the head coach's son is also emerging as a Power 4 quarterback prospect. If you need a second quarterback, there's a guy literally in the head coach's backyard who could potentially emerge as an option. I'm not saying that will happen, but that's something to keep in mind as well in terms of bringing in a second quarterback. But, RJ Day, I was very impressed when I watched RJ Day at the Ohio State 7-on-7 tournament this summer. I think right now he's looking at other schools, probably going somewhere else where he would probably have a better chance to be a future starter than he would at Ohio State. But, I think he knows the head coach pretty well. If ultimately there's a determination between father and son that Ohio State could be a good fit for him, it's certainly a possibility one way or another that could happen. So we'll see a lot to unfold there, but I think getting Luke Fahey now, you feel pretty good about the progression forward at Ohio State. You feel like they've got a good pipeline here through 2027 in terms of future quarterback recruiting, and now they can kind of start looking more at 2028. Because you've got a guy in 2026, you got a guy in 2027. Now they can really kind of, while they're still looking at 2027 guys, they can also start looking more at that 2028 class and trying to continue to build out these quarterback classes for the future. Of course, Ohio State also trying to still build out this 2026 class. We know July 4th weekend is always a big weekend of commitments. Possible that Ohio State could potentially get one or two more players this weekend. A lot of the guys who were kind of expecting to be commitments around this time frame, they made their decisions over the past week, but at least one big decision coming on Friday, that being Felix Ojo, Ohio State's top offensive line target in this class, the number 7 overall prospect in the country. It seems like this one's going to come down to Ohio State and Texas. Probably would lean toward Texas being the pick here on Friday, but Ohio State, they're going to keep pushing until, the moment he makes that announcement on Friday, because we've talked about it before. That 5-star out-of-state offensive tackle, that's been the thing that's eluded Ohio State in recent years in recruiting. And Felix Ojo really represents the chance for Ohio State to get that guy in this class. And so that is certainly going to be a big thing to watch out for on 4th of July. And then also Jamir Perez, the defensive tackle from Glenville, hasn't said if he's committing on Friday, but did say on Tuesday night that he teased a big announcement coming on Friday. And I think there's a strong belief within the industry that although he is currently committed to Florida, that he is likely to flip to Ohio State based on, one, the fact that when Glenville has a top prospect, Ohio State typically gets that guy. They've already gotten one in his class with Sincere Johnson. He chose to make an official visit to Ohio State after already committing to Florida, and now he's talking about making a big announcement. And so we will see on Friday if that ends up being a commitment announcement from Jamir Perez, but a couple recruits to watch on 4th of July.
Yeah, and you said it there, Dan. Like, this is the 5-star tackle that Ohio State has so desperately wanted to get each cycle. It's been a solid first recruiting class for Tyler Bowen. You have some really quality 4-stars. They cast a wider net than in the past, which I think was a lot of the criticism at Justin Fry and even Greg Studrawa in the past, and being able to at least fill out a good, deep, solid O-line class. If you really want that A grade, though, if you want to get, receive full marks on the report card, need to land one of these big commitments, and it's kind of the last chance for him with a 5-star out-of-state tackle to go get a Felix Ojo. Like you said, it seems to be Texas is the lean, but Ohio State will make every effort to try and grab Ojo. And if it does, that would obviously, I think, pretty much solidify Tyler Bowen as an ace recruiter for Ohio State if he were able to pull out that surprise there. And, Jamir Perez, we talked a lot about defensive line recruiting sort of last week, and around the defensive tackle commitments Ohio State got. And I think this is kind of, if you can end up flipping Jamir, solidifying that core of 3 commitments there for the defensive tackle class, guys with maybe some upside that aren't going to, there's not 5 stars jumping off the page there, but you get a Damari Simeon, you get a Cameron Brickle, you have some good big bodies to work with there in the trenches. And I think it's a solid D-tackle class that you can try and mold into the future if you're Ohio State.
Yeah, I think Ohio State would still love to get Deuce Geralds in that defensive tackle class. I think he would be kind of a guy that would really elevate that defensive tackle group as a top 100 prospect. But I think if they can get Jamir Perez, add him to Damari Simeon, Cameron Brickle, it gives them a solid trio. Jamir Perez, really that big true nose tackle type too. I mean, Matt Patricia, you think about his best defenses in New England when he had Vince Wilfork manning the nose. That's the kind of guy that they hope Jamir Perez can be. He's already 330 pounds, that big, true nose tackle that Ohio State doesn't have a lot of on its roster right now. They have Caden McDonald. That's about it, and that's why we've talked a lot about defensive tackle depth concerns for this year. So a guy like Jamir Perez, I think, would be a big win in that regard, just to get a developmental in-state true nose tackle in there, and what he could bring, and still potentially leave the door open for one more addition at defensive tackle, while defensive end remains a big point of focus for Ohio State recruiting. Obviously, a couple disappointing misses for Ohio State over the past week. Carter Meadows going to Michigan, Landon Barnes going to Ole Miss, pairing that with Luke Wafel going to USC. That defensive end board started to dwindle a little bit. KJ Ford really probably the top target on the board, but if Ohio State isn't able to get him, may have to look at expanding the board there with only one defensive end commit in Kari Wilder. But if Ohio State can get Jamir Perez on Friday or in August or whenever he makes his final announcement, that would certainly help solidify things there on that interior defensive line. Well, thanks for joining us for another episode of Press Coverage. Enjoy your 4th of July if we don't talk to you again before then, and we'll be continuing to follow all the recruiting news that could happen this weekend over on 11warriors.com as we wait and see who will Felix Ojo pick. Will Jamir Perez choose to flip to Ohio State? And of course, the big news of today, Ohio State securing its quarterback for the 2026 class, Luke Fahey, 4-star quarterback from Mission Viejo, California. So for Andy Anders, I'm Dan Hope. This has been another episode of Press Coverage. We'll catch you next time.